Hello, A-Pushers. This presentation was produced by Barbara Elizabeth Babcock,
Ellis Ann Fitzhugh,
Jackson Robert Gushaw,
and Ronnie Durrell Brown Jr.
We hope you enjoy our American Revolution paper slide project.
First, we will start off with the Treaty of Paris, implemented in 1763. This treaty marked the end of the French and Indian War in North America. It divided French land up between Spain and Britain. Spain acquired the entire French western settlement, while the English only received Quebec for a short while. There were many repercussions following this treaty, including the proclamation of 1763. The colonists were seeking out minute ways to rebel against the mother country, and the king needed to reclaim his power. This ultimately led to the demise of salutary neglect.
Parliament was then appointed to reinstate the previous navigation laws, which required the colonists to trade with the British exclusively, and began to enumerate their everyday goods. As new problems emerged, Parliament became exceedingly stringent. They began to tax the colonists externally to pay off Britain's ever-growing war debts. The first of these ordinances was the Currency Act of 1764. The king no longer accepted paper money as the colonists' form of pay. Instead, he required them to use specie, which is gold and silver hard money. The head of Parliament, Robert Grenville, then passed the next ordinance, the Sugar Act of 1764. The Sugar Act essentially replaced the Molasses Act of 1733 as an updated and modified version. Previously, the Molasses Act only required a tax of 6 pence per gallon on imported foreign molasses. The Sugar Act actually cut the tax in half, but then proceeded to tax other foreign goods such as sugar, wines, coffee, and printed calico. As you could probably guess, the colonists were quite unhappy with the situation they were forced into.
The next act imposed on the British colonies was the Quartering Act, passed in 1765. This mandate forced the colonists to accommodate the regulars, British soldiers, by feeding them, caring for them, and allowing them to stay in their homes. The purpose of the Quartering Act was to enforce the compliance of the colonists in regards to paying their taxes and staying loyal to Britain. One of these ordinances put into action by Parliament received many more repercussions than the others. The Stamp Act of 1765 proved disastrous for both the colonists and the British. In summary, this act placed a stamp on every paper product or good packaged in paper, ultimately causing the colonists to have to pay a significant amount more just for buying everyday goods. In resistance, many people turned to protests, demonstrations, and overall refusal to pay their tariffs.
The Stamp Act Congress was a meeting for representatives from each British colony in opposition to the unjust taxation and treatment by the king. They proceeded to devise a plan of action to protest the British tariffs. Patrick Henry, a prominent leader in the Stamp Act Congress, helped to create the Virginia Resolves. This document proposed 6 resolves to be adopted by each colony. The first and second resolves stated that all men are British in the British colonies and should be treated and represented as if they were in Britain. The third resolve introduced the point that no unbearable taxes should be imposed upon anyone, British or not. The fourth stated that Virginians and colonists in general shouldn't be forced to pay taxes. They had no say in. The fifth and sixth resolves were not ever adopted because they were considered too radical.
On the contrary, many people took to violence as a way of protest. The Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams, for example, were known for the unorthodox ways of punishment and protest. They tortured, humiliated, and hung tax collectors and stamp markers to resist Parliament. To an extent, it worked. The Stamp Act was eventually repealed and replaced by the Declaratory Act, further demonstrating the power of Parliament. The Townshend Act, followed by the Declaratory Act, imposing 4 separate ordinances on the colonists, including the taxation of glass, lead, paints, and paper, and tea. These were all eventually repealed except the tariff on tea. In response to this, John Dickinson, a wealthy Pennsylvania lawyer, wrote a series of essays referred to the letters from a Pennsylvania farmer. These letters illustrated the frustration felt by the colonies. He argued that the colonies should be sovereign in their international affairs, and that the external taxes imposed upon them by Parliament were unconstitutional. Parliament was using these taxes for their own personal revenue, which is not allowed.
Meanwhile, the king began to send more unwelcome troops into the Boston area in 1770. In protest, Bostonians proceeded to interrogate the British soldiers and pelt the redcoats with balls of snow, ice, and clamshells. The redcoats fired their guns and killed 5 colonists and injured 6. This event sparked outrage among the colonists. Paul Revere drew an etching of the massacre, and the underlying purpose was to inform the colonists that the British are killing them and that something needs to be done to stop it. After the Townshend Act was repealed, the Committee of Correspondence was formed. The sole purpose of this group was to remind the colonists of the wrongs the British had committed against them. It reminded them of the animosity that they have towards the British and that it's going to get worse.
Following shortly after, the British give the British East India Company a monopoly, ultimately giving them control of all tea imports and exports in the colonies. They could sell it all whatever price they wanted and could tax it however they wanted. This ordinance actually lowered the price of tea by a small amount, causing the colonists to be even more wary of the British actions than before. In protest, the Sons of Liberty, dressed up like natives, boarded a ship and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. This infamous event is known as the Boston Tea Party. In response, the British passed the Corrosive Acts, aka the Intolerable Acts, closing the port of Boston so they couldn't have any imports or exports, revoking the charter of Massachusetts Bay, and making it a royal colony, and they reinstituted the Quartering Act. They also put colonists on trial in England under suspicion of harming an employee of the king.
The colonies organized a group called the First Continental Congress. They passed the Suffolk Resolves entailing 4 parts. They denounce the Intolerable Acts, which neglect them, encourage each colony to prepare a militia against the British, encourage them to boycott British goods, and finally instruct them not to pay their taxes. To the king, however, they send the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, a document explaining how they are not being treated fairly. They tell him that they are British citizens and lay down their rights and rights they should have as citizens of England. The king never responds. By doing so, he would be empowering the colonists by showing them that their problems were a concern for him. Realizing that the colonists were pushing harder to reform, he ordered troops to raid the armories at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. The British are coming. The British win at Lexington due to the unpreparedness of the Minutemen, colonist soldiers. However, the colonists prevail at Concord.
Following, the Second Continental Congress is formed. Here it is decided that the colonists need to prepare to go to war against the British. They pass 2 documents, the Declaration of the Necessity for Taking Up Arms, explaining the reasons for animosity and the push toward war to the king, and the Olive Branch Petition, begging the king to comply so they don't have to go to war. It ultimately elucidates the colonists' wishing and informs the king that they have a military and they will use it if need be. This was essentially the last warning for the British.
The Battle of Bunker Hill occurred when the British decided to charge the Minutemen at the top of Breed's Hill. They lined up in advance, proceeding to lose 40% of their troops. The Minutemen actually ran out of ammo, compelling the colonists to retreat. It proved to be one of the bloodiest battles during the Revolutionary War. Here, the king decides the colonists are in fact rebelling. He orders the British troops to burn down port cities in the colonies, offers freedom to Southern slaves to fight with the British regiment, and hired Haitians to eradicate the colonists.
In response, the colonists write the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Appointing Thomas Jefferson to draft it, it became the official declaration of war against the British by the colonists. It was no longer a matter of receiving justice, but now the colonists wanted to secede from England altogether. It entailed 3 parts. 1, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, the preamble, and 2, a list of grievances, and 3, declaring the colonies as free states. All of these events were important in ultimately causing the Great Rebellion. This did not happen because of one event alone, but instead numerous ones, no matter how insignificant they might seem. This revolution was one of the few that proved successful in history and is iconic in today's society. We hope you enjoy our paper slide project.